Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar with Survey and Spatial today. As you're aware, the title of the webinar is Practice Notes and Best Practice Guide for Land Surveying. And just a reminder for most of you who would have used our Slido platform that any questions you have throughout the presentation, please pop those questions into the Slido and we will have those answered at the end of our presentation today. So I'd now like to hand you over to Nick Taylor from Cuttress.
Awesome, thanks very much. Kia ora everyone, and thanks for tuning in today. I think we've got a lot of interest for this one. I think it's about 83 people registered. So yeah, good to see that this is a topic that many of you are keen to be involved with. For those who don't know me, Nick Taylor, based in the Kapiti Coast. And yeah, before introducing the speakers that I've got coming up, just like to acknowledge the contributions of the working group that we established about 3 years ago, I think it was, to start working on a system for surveyors to be specifically recognised for the work that we do in the road corridor, because we felt that there wasn't really space for us to operate under the current system. It didn't really recognise what we do. So we just want to thank those that have contributed. There was a lot of time and effort put in by a group of people who are acknowledged at the front end of the practice note. Also just want to acknowledge the contributions of Carl Fox, especially at S+SNZ, Owen Smallfield from Linz, and the team at Survey and Spatial New Zealand who co-funded this whole thing. So without them, it wouldn't have been possible. Just at the front end, we have produced an editable version of the current template to be used for submissions under the current system. So just want to confirm that will be sent out to everyone as well. In terms of our speakers today, I'll let them introduce themselves in more detail. But first up, we've got Ryan Cooney from Waka Kotahi. Ryan sort of spearheaded and been one of the main contributors on the new system that's coming in. So yeah, it's great to have Ryan along. We thank him for tagging in today. Also, Elise Freeman from Parallax, who has worked with us extensively over the last few years trying to put this practice note together. And she's really got a good understanding now, I think, of what surveys do, what we can, what the risk profile is for surveys in the road corridor, and how we should sort of react accordingly under this incoming system, which, as Ryan will go through, is designed to be an improvement on the current system, not just box ticking. It's actually a risk-based assessment to make our roads safer. So yeah, I'll pass over to Ryan.
Thanks, Nick. So to introduce myself quickly, Ryan Cooney, I am the Program Director, Road Worker Safety for Waka Kotahi, reporting to a governance group of CEOs from around the country of contractors, professional services consultants, WorkSafe and Waka Kotahi. Our goal at the moment is very much around the displayed title of this presentation is to change the way in which temporary traffic management is carried out in New Zealand with the goal of safety as an outcome. I'm actually just going to apologise. I've just had a quick look at my slide pack and realised there's a couple of reused slides in here which are not quite relevant for this. So if I skip over one quickly, my apologies. And I'm going to do that straight away. So a little bit of context just to kick us off. The record for safety at work sites is not fantastic. Obviously, safety is a very big conversation for Waka Kotahi at the moment, road to zero strategy, etc. But if we think specifically about work sites, it's not great. Something to note about these figures, though, is that it involves both the workers that are on the site, but also the members of the public that are traversing the site. And that's a really important point for this conversation. It is about the safety of everybody that is affected by these by activities on the road network. So whilst I strongly encourage the Institute members to think about their safety, they also are encouraged to think about how their activities affect the safety of others. So I briefly mentioned Road to Zero. Within that, there's a number of principles, but you can see 3 bullet points here on the screen that are highly applicable to our conversation. The goal is that we set up systems that create safety for everybody, assuming that there will be a mistake. We don't assume that people will know what to do and understand how to operate. So we're planning for good choices, but we're also planning for mistakes. There's another really important point here, which is around human vulnerability. In the guide itself, I talk about how a human being struck at 30 kilometers an hour has a reasonable chance of survival, up in the 90% range. A human struck at 60 kilometers an hour has a very poor chance of survival. And then we can carry on that same style of conversation for being in vehicles, etc. And obviously, this is all about safety being a critical decision-making priority. So very quick overview. I'm not going to talk to all these bullet points. There's a broader program of activities around road worker safety. Again, that's a misnomer as a title because it's about everybody. And within this, we have a number of pieces of which the guide is one topic of conversation. You can see there's reference to safety cameras or speed cameras for work sites, as well as a number of other things. And I anticipate that this program will continue to expand its scope over time. Just to reiterate our goal, everybody goes home safe every day. And you can see there the reference again to road workers and road users. So I'm a little unsure exactly where the community is at in terms of its knowledge and how up to date it is with the proposed changes. So I'll just do a small recap, which is that we consulted on the New Zealand Guide to Temporary Traffic Management draft in March, April this year. We received a lot of feedback in varying degrees of detail and engagement. It was quite polarizing, just to be really frank. And so a couple of things that are really worth noting amongst all of this is that the really big changes we're pushing for is that the organisations have the appropriate roles and responsibilities as per HASWA. And within that, there is responsibilities with regards to the road controlling authorities when they're not a client, and for utility organisations and organisations such as yourselves. I'll say this very strongly and bluntly, we do not believe that COPTM is aligned with the current requirements of legislation. I'll say this also very bluntly, COPTM is not legislation. It is not an approved code of practice, and compliance with it does not keep you out of court should something go wrong. So just strongly encourage organisations to think about what their legislative obligations are and then look to the industry best practice guides such as COPTM or HASWA, or sorry, not HASWA, the New Zealand Guide or whatever, as a method to try and give effect to the legislation that they need to give effect to. One thing that's really important, the New Zealand Guide has been designed deliberately to try and enable all organisations to give effect to their legislative obligations. And so within that, there is a big change to our processes. So risk-based planning, really bringing forward this idea that the critical thinking that happens before you design the cones and sign spacing is the most important thing. The geometric design around how you put out cones and signs is a subsequent activity that comes from risk-based thinking. I've spoken about road workers and road users. I've introduced this term of lowest total risk. What might be safest for the worker may not be safest for the member of the public, and vice versa. So we're trying to encourage this critical multi-criteria thinking through how to achieve lowest total risk. I'll come back to the hierarchy of controls. It's in a subsequent slide. So as I say, lots of different pieces of legislation, acronym soup. The pieces that are really important to note are just these ones that are captured here. So as an employer of staff, your obligations are to give effect to HASWA, be that you as a client or as a contractor or as a subcontractor. However, the road controlling authorities have responsibilities under the LTMA and Local Government Act, and also Waka Kotahi needs to give effect to the Government Roading Powers Act. Plus, we have this thing called the Utilities Access Act, which has requirements of us. Hopefully, you've all picked up on this acronym is now wrong, but the good practice guide that WorkSafe released on the 31st of August called Keeping Healthy and Safe While Working on Roads and Roadsides. I hope I've got that correct. It's very close to it. And so all of this creates acronym soup, legislative requirements for us, but it's all a little messy. And so hence the New Zealand Guide is intended to try and bring all of this together and articulate a way of working, an operational practice which enables organisations to meet all of these legislative requirements. So I've said that twice now. Hopefully it's catching. I'm finding it's taking quite some time for various organisations to realise that the big square box around the outside is the really, really important bit. And compliance with COPTIM, or the New Zealand Guide, which is the little white bubble in the middle, is just a tool to achieve that. It's not about compliance with COPTIM or compliance with the New Zealand Guide. I might skip this one in the interests of time, but I strongly encourage you to think about what the difference between a hazard and a risk is. So part of this conversation has been around trying to understand, or trying to encourage the sector to think about hazards and risks, and they're not the same thing. A very short version of this is simply that a hazard is, I'll use the example that's in the New Zealand Guide. A hazard is the shark in the sea, but that's of no consequence to anybody unless somebody goes swimming. And so the thing we're trying to change up the conversation around is we actually really don't mind a hazard being in place as long as nobody is exposed to that hazard. It's all really around this idea that if you can avoid exposure to the hazard, the shark, you don't go swimming, then that's a great outcome. It's not about getting rid of the hazard. We don't need to go and, dare I say it, kill the shark. This is a little video that may be worth a quick Google search, and I'm happy to share the link as a way of trying to explain the difference between hazards and risks. So, something that's super important, and this is where I find there is a lot of people start debating the idea of what is risk and how we are all different in our perception of risk. So I'll make a crude point here, but I've fallen off a motorbike and broken my neck. Very, very lucky to survive that, but my perception of risk is likely to be very different from somebody else's perception of risk. I'm not saying I'm crazy, by the way, but yes, things happen. So the really important point then is to think about how we can deal with, or what's our obligations, and noting that the hierarchy of controls is captured in the Health and Safety at Work Regulations 2016. They set out our method to dealing with risk, and we have to give effect to this. This is not negotiable. So the concept, hopefully you can see here, is that our most preferred way, and where we must start, is with this idea of eliminating the risk. Conversely, putting on your PPE is the most, or is the least preferred, and it's the least effective way of managing risk. Do not assume that PPE will keep you safe. You are making a very big assumption that will be effective. Please don't misunderstand me though. PPE is still an important part of the system, but it should be your last line of defense, not your first line of defense. So if I'm not a surveyor, so my apologies if this is not a great example, but remote survey, remote detection of whatever it is that you need to capture, and therefore not having a human in the firing line is the preferred method. It's actually, I would argue, that's substituting. You're changing the way in which you do the work to be able to make it as safe as possible. Not undertaking the activity in the first place would be a way of eliminating risk. Alternatively, another way of eliminating risk is closing the road. But I draw your attention back to that idea of lowest total risk if you were to close a road. So think very, very hard every time you go into the field around how you can apply the hierarchy of controls to eliminate before you move into this substitute, isolate, engineer through to the PPE approach to managing risk. As I say, this is legislative requirement. It's not an optional thing. And the thing that's really helpful with it, as I say, is that it removes the human factor, the crazy. It brings it back to a very logical process as opposed to perception. All right. The reason why lowest total risk is important, and unfortunately this slide pack is not showing the way quite I had hoped it, but I'm sure you can bear with me because you're all very spatially aware folk. Nelson to Westport journey through State Highway 6. If we happen to have a work site somewhere near Murchison, the only way to make that as safe as possible is to close the road. The picture hiding in the background here is showing us a very narrow cross section, and there's not a lot of space for anybody to go. But if we close the road, the public end up on a 5-hour longer journey, and so there is a risk that becomes an 8-hour total journey. There is a risk to the members of the public that are using that alternate route. And so what I would assert is that we've simply transferred risk. We haven't actually reduced the risk as much as possible. And so this is where the creative thinking and the smart folks out there in the community are strongly encouraged to think about what's the best way to manage the risk at a particular site. Again, it's a little unfortunate you can't see the Google image in the middle there, but the cross section's quite narrow, and so therefore to put out our traditional safety zones, which we're now calling exclusion zones, is actually very challenging if you were undertaking a work such as putting in a culvert or something that takes a little bit of width. So therefore, this starts to hint at doing things like stop-stop closures, where you stop all the traffic for a period of time to undertake your work, and then let that traffic go whilst the worker is out of the road. And I would hope that many activities that you good folk are involved in would enable you to think about applying types of practices such as that. And I know Elise will speak to the practice note in just a moment. So I will try and wrap up with these next two slides. Firstly, we have received all the feedback, 1,200 lines of feedback. Thank you very much to those who contributed. It was, as I say, it was quite diverse in its feedback, so it made it quite challenging. However, what we have done is we've identified, it's actually 10 major changes now to enable us to publish version 1 of the New Zealand Guide. The intention with that is to move from our theoretical conversations to practical conversations. So what we're looking to do as Waka Kotahi, as a client organisation, as a contracting PCBU, to use Haswell words, is to engage with our contractor PCBUs to test and trial via basically some of our network outcome contracts, which are maintenance contracts, and some of our capital or improvement projects. We have identified 5 NOC contracts that we will be piloting the guide through. We're still working on some capital ones. And essentially what we're doing is we're going to test and trial and learn about many different things, such as training and competency, resource requirements, contractual terms, procurement terms, etc. And in short, we are looking to a substantial change in the way in which we contract for TTM. It may be as far as saying simply that when we seek to engage a contractor to Waka Kotahi, we will have a provisional sum approach to temporary traffic management, and we seek a proposed methodology which becomes part of the assessment of the bid. The cost for delivering TTM is not fixed at that through a methodology such as that. It's back to the fact that as a contracting or the client PCBU, we have obligations to purchase health and safety outcomes, not to minimize cost. So it's a very big change, and it is definitely quite challenging to work this through my broader set of colleagues, but we have a mandate to continue at this point in time. Conversely to that, we cannot tell, and this is quite a loaded comment, so I suggest you capture this one well, but we cannot tell RCAs or other organisations that are not directly contracted to Waka Kotahi how to manage their obligations under HASWA or the Local Government Act or other matters such as that. So what we are looking to do is continue our ongoing communication with RCAs, etc. Literally after this, I'm running in to meet one of the councils to have a conversation about how they might adapt to their processes. And we hope over time that the sector will collectively move to being far more aligned with this risk-based approach. I will congratulate Spatial and Survey NZ for being right at the forefront of adapting to find a way to better suit your activities and manage risk associated with your activities. And so that in turn is around encouraging innovation. I will put an offer out there, and to be really frank, this is a little bit of an offer. It actually makes my life a little more challenging, but it's exactly what we're wanting to see, which is around how can we use the tools and equipment we do have available to us to best effect to manage risk. So, for example, a advanced warning variable message sign, or ADUB as many know them as, which is the little flashy truck that would follow this one, which is hopefully you can see me pointing at the attenuator truck in my background. There's talk about using them to display temporary speed limits for mobile operations. It's currently not legislatively allowed, or it's not allowed under the traffic control devices rule, but it absolutely makes sense. And so I will leave my parting comments now to basically say, keep thinking about how you can innovate and use the tools and equipment available to you to keep yourself as safe as possible. One tiny wee caveat, we do have to work through processes such as changing the traffic control devices rule if you wish to change the way in which equipment is either used or displayed. So hence that's the bit around making my life slightly more challenging. All right, I will pause there. I'm happy to take questions, but I'll pass back to MC for the session to facilitate from here on in.
Beauty, thanks very much, Ryan. I guess over to Elise. Now, Elise was, basically integral into putting this whole thing together. She really understands surveys and surveying needs in the road corridor. She's really been our go-to and has done a great job of putting together the practice note, I think, so that it's logical to follow. So, over to Elise.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks, Ryan, for that update. It's very handy. It's great to have you with us today. So as Nick said, I have worked with surveyors for the last few years on how essentially the industry needs to try and fit in with what was COPDM. And it's really exciting that the guide comes out, because not having to try and comply with such a prescriptive-based document is awesome. So it was nice to see that we could try and create a nationwide document that we can get in front of RCAs and say, look, this is how surveys work. This is how we operate. And this is how we think we can do that safely without trying to, prescribe to COPDM. So all I wanted to do today, my part, was just to go over a few key points to help you understand how to use the practice note, and also kind of talk a little bit about what I'm calling like the dual system, which is what we're probably going to have to work under for the next little while until the guide gets rolled out. So first of all, I started, hopefully this flicks over, yep. So first of all, I just wanted to go over the roading terms. All right, so I kept them very constant throughout the practice note. And I wanted to just give you a reminder, because I understand that these may be a little TTM, some of the terminology. I wanted to make sure that they were universal in what I used, because it was very important. I started with the constant. So the constant being, you're always going to have a work vehicle to get to your site, and there's going to be somebody in that work vehicle that's going to exit it to conduct the work. So they were my two constants that I started with. And from there, I broke it down further and further and further into, where will that vehicle park? And then where will the surveyor be undertaking their work? And then on top of that, what equipment will they have with them? And then layer on top of that, where will that equipment be placed? So those were the kind of layers that I started out with. And then from there, I could break it into environmental factors. So once we've got all of that information sorted, okay, what kind of road are they going to be working on? So first of all, your terms, your roading terms, just really quickly. Road reserve, all right, so that is your RCA controlled piece of road, all right, so from boundary to boundary, and stops where your private property begins. So there's your boundary line, you've got back berm, footpath, front berm, your carriageway, so edge of seal to edge of seal. So when I'm talking about roadside, and you'll see roadside crop up a lot, and there is a very extensive glossary of terms in the front of the practice note. So when I'm talking about roadside, I'm talking about from that curb and channel, or from the edge of seal, or where the chip runs out on the shoulder, then we move into roadside, okay? So anywhere where a vehicle would not typically be parked or driving or operating, that's our roadside. Curb and channel, shoulder, edge line, center line, live line, they're all very basic standard terms that you should be familiar with. And then I understand that there is a possibility that there are some people on the call today that may not have been introduced to the new categories of road. This has been out now for, I believe, just over a year. Some of the new categories, some of the TTM warrants are now tied to these categories as well. So this did help form a lot of my risk-based assessments when it came to what I thought was appropriate to put into the practice note. So I think it's very important that everybody understands and is updated on the categories of road, because it links directly into the diagrams that you'll be selecting. So first of all, we've got our category A environments. Okay, they're our low speed environments, 60-kilometer roads and less. Okay, so it does include your 60K roads. They can be low volume, level 1, level 2 LS, or level 2 roads. They can be bidirectional, or they can be multiple lanes in one direction, as long as it's low speed. It's categorized as a category A road. Then we jump up to our category B roads. Okay, if you think these are more of our rural-based roads, they typically are from 70 Ks up to 100 kilometers an hour. They can be low volume, level 1 and level 2. Most of them will have very small shoulders, okay? Not a lot of space to pull over onto the side of the road, as we see in our rural type environments. They are mostly bidirectional, okay? But it does include areas where you've got passing lanes. So just because a category B road opens up with a passing lane, it doesn't make it a category C, which is, you'll see in a moment, our high-speed multi-lane roads are our category C roads. Okay, so typically, and now we actually have quite a few in the 110 kilometer an hour permanent speed limit. So 70 up to 110, and we're looking at multi-lanes. Yep, motorways and expressways. They can still be level 1 roads. You think of all those expressways to Hamilton, some of those are still level 1 roads, but they're multi-lane now, so we treat them as a category C road. Our off-ramps are also, on-ramps and off-ramps are also included as a category C road. Right, so within the document, there is an updated table of who can do what. Now, as long as you are either the old TC inspector warrant or the new practicing inspector warrant, you can do everything that you see in that grey and green box. I took quite a lot of time to make sure that the diagrams that I produced aligned with these warrants and didn't step outside or start to step into an area which would require a surveyor to take on a higher level of qualification. So that's why some of the static equipment is optional based on your risk assessment, but it was noted that there was a need in some situations to put cones out. So we'll go over that in a moment. But basic qualification is your TC inspector for the old qualification, or the new qualification, which is called the practicing inspector. So once I worked through all of those scenarios and I started breaking out the types of operations that I felt were appropriate, a few exclusions did come up. So a few areas did pop up which I felt nobody would be comfortable going out to undertake work. So the first one would be that there's static equipment required in the shoulder of a category C road. So if you can imagine trying to set up a tripod on the shoulder of a motorway, I just did not feel like that was an appropriate operation to include. So I have excluded it from the practice note. I believe that there needs to either be a static shoulder or a semi-static TMP applied for in that circumstance. And same goes, the majority of RCAs throughout the country will not let you access the live lane under an inspection activity. So that is not included in the practice note. And finally, scenario 3 was where there is the presence of a cycle lane. I'm going to show you a little bit more detail on this, just so you get a visual for what I came up against. So very common in a lot of our urban environments now, we have these lovely cycle lanes. Scenario number 1 being there's parking lanes close to the curb and channel where you may need to set up your tripod, which is fantastic. You'll be able to park your work vehicle in the normal parking bay and undertake your work. However, if you were trying to undertake a survey on the other side of the road, or the left-hand side of the road in your screen, you would have to park your work vehicle in that cycle lane if you wanted to put your tripod on the curb and channel, which would then mean the cyclist would be pushed into the live lane, and that was not acceptable. So you will see there is an acceptable layout that I have included at the start of the practice note. So in this scenario, totally fine for you to undertake your survey with your static equipment straddling the curb and channel. But if you did come up with in the scenario, you did go out to site and see that you were going to be lumped with this scenario here, we would be looking at a site-specific TMP in order to close that cycle lane. So that's just a little more context around that third exclusion category there. There was no real way I could see it working. I did kind of workshop it and try and figure out, could you park back and then put a cone out next to your tripod? But even that, I just didn't feel comfortable. I thought, cyclists have their head down a lot of the time. They're not looking up too much in front of them, and having them swerve out around equipment, I didn't find the risk acceptable. So if you did want to check through those categories that we went over earlier, your level of road and your categories, maybe you're interested in lane width and whether or not it's arterial or non-arterial, there is a great website, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. It's called Mobile Roads. You can just register and click on the RCA where you're going to be operating. It'll load up all of the information on the network, and then you press start and it will pop up a map like this. You find the road that you're going to be operating on, right click, and the information for that road will pop up. So some of the information that will be given to you, and it's not always consistent. Sometimes you have to go and look at multiple databases in order to gain all of the information that you need, but it's pretty good. So you will get the road level in there, the operating speed, the carriageway width, as well as whether or not it's arterial, non-arterial, urban type environment. So that's really important because we kind of got through the first iteration of the practice note and sent it out to the working group, and they came back and said, there are areas where trying to maintain the lane width, so we were always trying to maintain the lane width so that a vehicle wasn't pushed over a centre line when driving past the work vehicle that was parked. And it came to our attention that, well, a lot of times you guys operate in new subdivisions, or sometimes there's rural environments, and there's not even a delineated centre line. And parking is actually designed to be in the movement lane often as well. Sometimes there's indented parking spaces. There's a whole lot of other factors that started to play into making it, we made the diagrams too prescriptive in a sense. And so this next iteration that we came out with was, all right, we need to split our operations into arterial and non-arterial and look at the risk profile of those two types of roads. So I dove into the One Road Network documentation and had a look at some Austroads stats as well about maintaining lane widths on certain types of road, and really happy with what we came out with. We've got different sets of diagrams for arterial and non-arterial environments. Here's a really good diagram to show, in those new subdivisions that you may be surveying, they don't have center delineation. They don't have line marking. Everybody parks on the curb and channel. That's where you park. That, a lot of them don't even have driveways or garages that you park off the street. Parking in the movement lane on the road is acceptable, and that may not allow for an entire lane width as we know it, 3 meters or so, to be maintained. So we wanted to make that really clear that this is completely acceptable, and we were happy to accept that risk. that did make for quite a few diagrams, as you can imagine. We've split it out. Therefore, there are 5 flowcharts, decision flowcharts, to help you choose the correct diagram. So once you know the level of road that you're working on, the category of road that you're working on, and whether or not it's arterial or non-arterial, it's quite easy to navigate your way through these flowchart. So you can see non-arterial, there's just one. It's very simple, but once you start getting up to those arterial roads, it is split into roadside, strictly roadside activities, roadside and shoulder activities, and then activities where you need to access the live lane. So there's 3 charts for that. And then the final one is any arterial roads where you're going to be working behind a permanent barrier system. So there's a couple of diagrams in there as well, because there's a lower risk there working behind a permanent barrier system. So those are the charts that are available to you. If you have any questions, or if something doesn't flow, please let me know. It is designed for you to be able to take out into the field and use, as you're doing your on-site risk assessment, which diagram is going to be most applicable for you. So just a quick comparison around that arterial and non-arterial. Both of these operations have a tripod straddling the curb and channel or on the roadside, and both of the operations have a surveyor needing to access the live lane to take a mark. So when we got feedback from the first time round, surveyors said that often they have to park their vehicle where everyone else usually parks their vehicle, and that can block the signage on the back of their vehicle, so that they wanted an option to be able to walk out a static advance warning sign. I didn't see an issue with that. Most of the time, roadside, you can walk it out. We do just ask that if you did need to install it, you park your vehicle in front of it while you install it, and you obviously install it from the side of the road. They also came back with wanting to keep the parking bay in front of the work vehicle vacant. So being able to place 5 cones along the front of the work vehicle to keep that park free and protect the tripod slightly, that was put in there. Note that it is optional though. Okay, so you'll see that they are grayed out on the diagrams, and it is an option. It's not 100% needed every time. Now, the other thing that was on here is for the arterial roads, we noticed that there was a risk the further away that you operate from your work vehicle. Therefore, we want to see you limiting the forward working distance from your work vehicle. And I have prescribed that on here from some information that I found in documentation. So for those high-speed environments, we don't really want to see you working more than 50 meters away from the front of your work vehicle. But in the lower speed environments, 100 meters away from the front of your vehicle seemed appropriate from what I found. Obviously, you're opening yourself up to more risk being further away from your warning and your protection of your vehicle. So more opportunity for an errant vehicle to maybe leave the roadway and collide with the surveyor, which is what we're trying to avoid. Right. So the dual system, we're not transferring over to the guide anytime soon, I believe, and we need to be prepared for some local RCAs to potentially not adopt it at all, and they may want to stay with the code. So right back at the start, when Nick and I had our first conversations, we were trying to figure out how do we do this so that we can start to move towards the guide and do something that's really applicable to the way that surveys work, but at the same time, still be able to get you guys access to the network by having a TMP put in. So we've created, and I've just updated this recently, editable PDF. So only the sections on the PDF that need editing can be edited. Everything else is locked, so you can't maybe accidentally copy and paste and make a mistake in here. So what this allows you to do is just input the details for your RCA, who's doing the work, where you will be working, and grab the practice note as an attached document. All of the diagrams are in there. It's all listed, ready to go for you in the Proforma, and that will be ready for you to submit to your RCA for approval under the current system that we're running now. Hopefully in the future, there will be RCAs that will just allow us to run off the practice note. So that will be your document. But in the meantime, we still need a TMP to go and access the network. So that's why we've got this. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for you just to fill in the details and submit that to your RCA. Yeah, so that is, that's my part done. So I think we've got, a good 20 minutes left, and I'm sure that there's loads of questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elise. There are actually no questions. So obviously everyone's fully up to speed on what everyone needs to do, which is great. I guess I just talked to a little bit about why we started this process originally. And obviously with the type of work that we do, especially with cadastral work, it's a lot different to an engineering setup where you've got a defined area that you're going to have to operate in on any one given day. So the nature of cadastral surveying, you try and find some marks close to close to your boundaries and then sort of expand and go. So it was just really difficult. We found a lot of different RCAs had really different approaches to how that is managed. And we would often have generic plans in place to enable us to set up on the day wherever we needed to, based on the marks we needed to find. But a lot of councils weren't allowing that. They weren't allowing generic plans to be approved. So that was causing quite a bit of a headache for a lot of members. So that was one of the things. And I guess the other part of it as well was some firms have obviously access to more resources in terms of traffic management equipment than others. So trying to make sure that what we end up producing for surveys across the country was actually usable for the hopefully for everyone. As Elise said, we tried to limit how many cones that we put in there and sort of signage and things, just to make sure that we were applying it safely, but also being realistic in terms of the equipment that we needed to carry with us. I do also just want to touch on the limitations around this. So there are certain situations where we do not believe this is obviously applicable to use as a generic plan. And so if you are wanting to, for instance, open manhole in the middle of a live lane, obviously that's going to require a higher level of traffic management than what this practice note allows for. So I'm not sure what others in the industry are doing, but certainly for us, we will bring in external traffic management consultants to manage that for us. And we found that quite an effective way of making sure that we're doing everything properly and safely. The other thing as well, as Elise mentioned, just trying to stick to the limitations around training requirements. I'm not sure if anyone's tried to get a new STMS through lately, but obviously it's much more onerous than the previous system in terms of obtaining that qualification. So we really wanted to just make sure that we were sticking with within the sort of inspector qualification sort of jurisdiction, I suppose, so that we didn't so that the surveyors weren't required to spend 3 weeks going through STMS training. Elise, do you want to just talk about the Performer and its use in relation to, I guess, you preparing it and and the importance of other people not tampering with it?
Yeah. So one of the questions came through, do you have to be a qualified TTM planner in order to submit traffic management plan? Short answer, no. Long answer, you have to be an approved TTM planner to design it, write it, put it all together, stamp your name on it, which is what I've done, which is why I've locked the PDF for anything other than just updating certain contractor details and contact numbers. So my work is locked. What I've put in there from a designer's and a planner point of view, which is why my name is on the pro forma. So essentially, I am the qualified person for that TMP, but all that you are doing is doing an admin-based role, which is combining it and submitting it to your RCA. So that was part one. Part two, there was a comment, will it AT accept to the practice guide rather than requiring a generic TMP? Short answer to that is nope. You still need to submit a TMP, a generic TMP, not so much. So I do believe we've got Thomas may be with us today, but he can't speak. But it has been submitted once at the moment, the practice note, along with the PDF of my pro forma as a complete, I guess you could call it a generic, but a very specific, industry-specific generic. It has been submitted to AT. I'm not sure how he's getting on with the approval of that. However, we have had a very stripped back version of the practice note put into AT and approved multiple times. But in the meantime, no, AT is still running with Coptum. So we have to put in and follow the same system that we have been for the last little while.
Cool. Thanks, Elise. So I guess we've also down here sent it into Wellington City Council as well. They've got a couple of minor things that they've come back to us on, but nothing too major at this stage. I think Thomas may have put that he has lodged that a fortnight ago with AT, and they're still reviewing the forms and diagrams at this stage. So perhaps we can keep members updated on that as well.
That'd be good.
There's a question here: do you recommend surveyors do any official traffic control or STMS training for the kind of work covered in the practice note? I guess, I don't know. Elise, you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so definitely in the meantime, I mean, I do understand that these warrants last for 3 years, and I'll touch on it briefly, but there will most likely be a new system being rolled out. I'm not sure timeline-wise, Ryan, 12, 18 months?
Something like that.
Something like that, which is definitely more unit standard-based, micro-credential-based, which will just see very specific roles and unit standards and micro-credentials being undertaken for the work that needs to be done. But in the meantime, while we're on this dual system, I highly recommend anyone who is expiring to only do the inspector warrant. That is a one-day warrant. You can do the theory and the practical all in one day and be a practicing inspector. And that is how I designed, or that's the qualification that I designed the practice note to fit with. So that's my recommendation. Do not go ahead and take any higher level of TTM. It's not applicable to you. The TMO or an STMS, don't go there. And if you're refreshing, you can just refresh back at the inspector warrant in the meantime, especially if you're operating in Auckland.
So the one thing I would add further to that is that Waka Kotahi is looking to turn off the current warrant system. Essentially, it's inconsistent with HASWA. The obligation is on the employer to make sure their staff are appropriately trained and qualified. By proxy, we've been providing the service that gives you a method to train and qualify your staff. And the future, the 18-month-ish conversation that Elise is referring to is a group of employers. So typically the tier 1 contractors and ACE consultants, etc. It'd be great for Spatial and Survey to have a representative on that group. But essentially, it is around the employers making sure that they have a system that they can have confidence in bringing their staff up to speed to keep themselves as safe as possible. So the change is very much around moving from us telling you to enabling you to figure out what's appropriate for you. And there's lots of examples where, such as the environment behind me, it's far more complicated than just having an STMS warrant. Many contractors now have requirements around first aid training and obviously having I'm pointing the wrong direction, over that way, the appropriate truck license, etc. So just think about all the things you need to do to keep yourself safe when you're out on the road network. And it's not just a TTM warrant.
Thanks, team. I guess as well, as Ryan mentioned, there will be an opportunity for Survey and Spatial to put forward a representative, so an industry representative. So I guess if anyone out there does want to be involved in that, then please feel free to get in touch, and we can see how we can manage that going forward based on the level of interest, I suppose. I think that was probably...
There's one further question I might grab, if it's all right, Nick. It's around the RCA engagement.
Yep.
So I mentioned about how Waka Kotahi is not actually legally able to tell RCAs what to do, and that is entirely correct at this point. There's been a long history of I'll just say overstepping the mark a little bit, and the way in which we reacted and operated was interpreted as basically instructing the sector. A big part of this is us making sure that we appropriately operate and hold our space, but we don't over-egg it, if I can use that type of language. But what we're conscious of is that's creating a big void, and the risk is a very real risk, and it's a very real position at the moment where a number of RCAs are saying we don't like it, we're going to stick with COPDM. Primary reason is because under COPDM they have authority as the final signatory to the TMP. Under the new system, they become a collaborator in the development of the risk assessment, but they don't sign off the TMP. It's actually the organisation that is imposing the risk on the road or carrying out the activity on the road that needs to sign off the TMP. You've got to be responsible for your own activities as an operator on the network. So that's not very comfortable for many of them. Let's be fair. I mentioned the polarising response to the New Zealand guides. RCAs typically are quite uncomfortable at the moment. The inverse to that is that my role as a leader of this space, I'm not part of the client side of Waka Kotahi, and I'm not a part of the road controlling authority side of Waka Kotahi, but my role is to continue to keep talking to the RCAs around this change and how they need to think about their business and how they run it. I'm obviously encouraging them strongly to think about the fact that there is HASWA and there is Local Government Act and there's all these other acts that are out there that they need to give effect to, and that what they're doing at the moment is quite risky to their business and it's inconsistent with current legislation. So that's my role, is to keep advocating for change. I've obviously got a strong thought on that. They're welcome to their own thoughts, and we'll continue to try and advocate for change to this new way of working, but I can't force them to. So it's not like you're going to be the only ones who are pushing for this, although I do encourage you to push for appropriate allocation of responsibilities. I say it like this to the tier one contractors: if a tier one contractor has been and done their homework and genuinely believes a road closure is the right way to undertake the work, and it creates lowest total risk for everybody involved, and an RCA says no, you have to do it under manual traffic control. It is a bit cheeky, but I'm encouraging the lead contractors to say, we'll put that in writing as an instruction to the RCA, because it's not appropriate that the councils dictate solutions to the folks that are out on the ground. And if I be really, really blunt in that conversation, when it goes wrong, case law to date, it's always been the contractor that's been prosecuted, not the RCA. So I went and worked for Downer New Zealand. I joined them a month after there was a fatal incident involving a cyclist on the Christchurch Southern Motorway project. Downer and McConnell Dowell's, a JV, got prosecuted, not the Christchurch City Council, Selwyn District Council, Waka Kotahi. Exactly the same in Matata and a number of other incidents. So this rebalancing is very important to give effect to law, but it is not something I can force upon the RCAs. They have to realise this for themselves, and my sense is that in time they will find it extremely uncomfortable to keep operating the way they are. They've just got to get to that realisation themselves. So it's a fairly hefty point, and it's quite different to the conversation that Elise was bringing to the table, but I think it's really important to understand both parts to this. You've got obligations as a contractor or as an operator on the road network, and it's really important that you think about what Elise has put in front of you, and is that doing everything reasonably practicable, applying the hierarchy of controls, etc., to keep yourselves and others safe. Sorry, it's pretty heavy stuff for a Friday morning, but yeah.
Yeah, it's important. Thank you, Ryan. And yeah, Elise, a couple of questions about training recommendations and also Christchurch City Council.
Yeah, so yes, my recommendation, especially if you're operating under the TMP, which I believe 100% of the submissions at the moment will be operating under submitting a TMP, you will need to hold the inspector warrant in order to operate and own that TMP on the day. And then whomever went to submit to Christchurch City Council, renowned for being very difficult for getting approvals. I'm actually personally interested in what the decline notes were. So if you could get in touch, that would be great. That would be, and maybe I can have a chat.
Cool.
I'm off to see Christchurch City Council in half an hour.
Oh, well, there you go. You tuck my note under your arm and away you go.
Since I actually ran the Christchurch T-Team department for 5 years, so yeah. Oops.
That was after you that I was mentioning.
Yeah, it must have been after you, Ryan. Just one more note here as well to come through. Is it now up to S+SNZ local branches to engage with local RCAs? Is there a strategy to roll this out locally? So I guess at the national level, we wanted to provide a industry best practice standard for surveyors to utilise, and we're going through a process with Ryan and his team around getting official endorsement, I suppose, from Waka Kotahi to have that as, I guess, added weight to the discussions with the local RCAs to say that, yeah, look, Waka Kotahi's reviewed it and is happy to endorse it. That's obviously not putting any, I guess, risk on them, but just something that we can use in those conversations with the local RCAs. In terms of local branches, yeah, I guess if there are common problems that we're seeing with the implementation, then I think it would be best to raise with local branches. But in terms of any further changes in rollouts based on area, on the local RCAs and the feedback we're getting, that obviously will require engagement back with Elise and the team at Parallax to change the performance that's been set up. I think I can't remember how many RCAs are there, Elise? 90 something?
Yeah.
It wasn't
68.
really deemed
68.
Oh, sorry, 68. Wasn't really deemed, I guess, an effective use of resource for S+SNZ to cover, I guess, all of that engagement across the entire country. So I think it will be up to local members to have those discussions with the RCAs, and yeah, I guess feed that back, I suppose, if we do a revision to Elise, that we can incorporate some of that stuff that's been asked for, with the acknowledgement, I suppose, that some RCAs will want something and then some RCAs will want something completely different. So I guess what we've tried to do is prepare a base document that can be used, I guess, in a broad sense, but at that sort of micro level, it's sort of up to the individuals to progress that with the RCAs.
I'm also very keen to hear where you're getting common threads and issues. I don't want to get into detailed specific. I just don't have capacity for that. But where there's common threads and issues coming up, I'm also very keen that Survey and Spatial New Zealand feedback to me, because it's obviously informative around educating the RCAs around their roles and responsibilities. So please know that we're with you in this as much as we can be, given there's very many layers to the TTM conversation.
Yeah, but I think it is a good idea to use your local branches as a obviously sounding board and sort of bounce things off each other and feed that up to your branch chairs. I'm also on the branch chairs forum as well, so that will hopefully come back to me as well. So yeah, please do use the local resources and network that we have to try and sort of respond to any common issues that we find. So yeah, please do that.
And it may just be like a real quick thing that I can point to a certain part of the practice note and we can take a snip of that and send it to the RCA, and that might get them on their way, because I don't expect that every RCA is going to sit down with a cup of tea in the evening and read my practice note. Would be nice, but so yeah, sometimes it's just the fact that maybe we just need to take a small snippet and be like, here's what we're talking about, and this is why we've applied this certain thing, especially the risk assessment.
Yep. And yeah, just a note, I suppose, that if there are any comments or feedback, I suppose, after reviewing it maybe in full with a cup of tea one evening, or once you've submitted it through to the RCA, then yeah, Survey and Spatial National Office are happy to kind of be the sort of conduit for those discussions. So if you can send anything through to admin@surveyspatial.org, yeah, we can sort of make sure those messages are getting through to the right people. And I guess just finally, I want to thank everyone for the feedback since we've sent this out. It's been pretty positive overall. So yeah, thanks for everyone for taking the time to get into this, and yeah, hopefully we've produced something that is of benefit to surveys across the country. So yeah, that probably wraps everything up. thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your Friday.